For 43 consecutive nights, retired forest ranger Thomas McKenna heard the same gentle tapping on the front door of his remote cabin in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest of Washington State, a soft, rhythmic knocking that came precisely at 9:15 p.m., followed by the sound of something small settling on his wooden porch to wait through the long, cold hours until dawn. What Thomas initially dismissed as a raccoon or other woodland creature seeking shelter would prove to be something far more extraordinary and heartbreaking. An orphaned Sasquatch infant, no more than 2 years old, who had somehow identified Thomas as the one human who might provide the safety and care that had been stolen when government hunters killed its family during a classified capture operation. The tiny creature, barely 3 feet tall and covered in soft brown fur, possessed intelligence that exceeded that of human children its age, emotional depth that would bring Thomas to tears, and a desperate need for connection that would ultimately expose a government conspiracy involving the systematic extermination of cryptid families and the cover-up of evidence that these beings possessed consciousness, language, and family bonds that rivaled anything in human society. What began as nightly visits from a frightened orphan would evolve into the most profound interspecies friendship ever documented, challenging everything science thought it knew about intelligence, emotion, and the capacity for love that transcends the boundaries between species. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and comment down below where you're watching from. Thomas McKenna had spent 37 years as a forest ranger in the Pacific Northwest, patrolling the vast wilderness areas of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, with a dedication that had cost him his marriage, his relationship with his children, and most of his social connections outside the Forestry Service. At 64 years old, he had retired to a small cabin he had built with his own hands on 40 acres of private land adjacent to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, seeking the solitude and peace that only the deep wilderness could provide. The cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road that stretched 12 miles from the nearest paved highway, surrounded by old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock that created a natural barrier between Thomas's property and the outside world. The isolation was complete. No cell phone service, no internet, no neighbors within 20 miles. Thomas had chosen this location specifically because it offered the kind of absolute privacy that allowed him to live without the complications and demands of modern society. Thomas had always been more comfortable with trees than people, finding in the forest a sense of purpose and belonging that human relationships had never provided. His ex-wife Sarah had often complained that he loved the wilderness more than his family, and Thomas had never been able to deny that accusation. The forest was predictable, honest, and beautiful in ways that human society seemed incapable of achieving. "I understood the forest," Thomas would later reflect. "Every sound, every smell, every change in the weather or the behavior of the animals. The wilderness spoke a language that I had learned over decades of careful observation, and I felt more at home among the trees than I ever had in any city or town." The cabin itself was a modest structure, built from logs that Thomas had cut and milled himself using traditional techniques that his grandfather had taught him as a child. The building featured a single large room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a sleeping loft, and a covered porch that faced west toward the mountains. Solar panels provided electricity for basic lighting and a small refrigerator, while a wood-burning stove supplied heat and cooking capability. Thomas had designed the cabin to be completely self-sufficient, with a well that provided fresh water, a septic system that handled waste, and a root cellar that allowed him to store food for extended periods without needing to make trips to town. He grew vegetables in a small garden, hunted deer and elk for meat, and gathered wild berries, mushrooms, and edible plants that supplemented his diet with foods that connected him to the land in ways that store-bought provisions never could. The property included a small workshop where Thomas crafted furniture and tools using traditional woodworking techniques, a greenhouse that extended his growing season for vegetables and herbs, and a network of hiking trails that he had cut through the forest to provide access to the most beautiful and secluded areas of his land. Every aspect of his retirement home had been designed to minimize his dependence on the outside world while maximizing his connection to the natural environment that had been his life's passion. The first night that Thomas heard the gentle tapping on his door, he assumed it was a raccoon or possibly a black bear investigating the sense of food that emanated from the cabin. Wildlife encounters were common in the deep forest, and Thomas had learned to coexist peacefully with the various creatures that shared his wilderness home. The tapping was different from what I would expect from a raccoon, Thomas documented in the journal he had begun keeping after his retirement. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, almost like someone knocking politely and waiting for a response. The sound came at exactly 9:15 p.m., just as Thomas was settling in for the evening with a book and a cup of coffee. The tapping consisted of 3 soft knocks, followed by a pause, then 3 more knocks repeated several times before stopping completely. After the knocking ended, Thomas could hear the sound of something settling on the wooden porch, as if whatever had been knocking was planning to wait there for an extended period. Thomas's first instinct was to investigate, but his years of experience with wildlife had taught him that direct confrontation was rarely the best approach to dealing with curious animals. Instead, he quietly moved to the window and peered through the curtains, trying to identify what kind of creature was visiting his porch. "I couldn't see anything clearly," Thomas noted. The porch was in shadow, and whatever was out there seemed to be sitting very still, almost like it was trying to avoid being seen. The visitor remained on the porch until dawn, when Thomas heard the sound of movement, followed by footsteps that seemed too heavy and deliberate to belong to any common forest animal. By the time Thomas opened the door to investigate, whatever had been there was gone, leaving only a few indentations in the wooden planks that suggested something substantial had been sitting on his porch for several hours. The pattern repeated the following night, with the same gentle tapping at 9:15 p.m., the same settling sounds and the same departure at dawn. Thomas began to realize that he was dealing with something far more intelligent and purposeful than a random wildlife encounter. "Whatever was visiting me had a routine," Thomas observed. "It came at the same time every night, behaved in the same way, and left at the same time every morning." That level of consistency suggested intelligence and intention that exceeded normal animal behavior. On the 3rd night, Thomas decided to try a different approach. Instead of hiding inside the cabin, he sat on the porch with a book and a small lantern, making himself visible but non-threatening to whatever creature was seeking his attention. The response was immediate and surprising. The gentle tapping came as usual at 9:15 p.m., but this time Thomas could see that it was coming from a small furry hand that barely reached the bottom of his door. The hand belonged to a creature that was unlike anything Thomas had ever encountered in his decades of forest experience. "I was looking at what could only be described as a baby Sasquatch," Thomas would later testify before congressional investigators. A tiny humanoid creature, no more than 3 feet tall, covered in soft brown fur, with large intelligent eyes that held depths of sadness and fear that broke my heart. The infant Sasquatch appeared to be approximately 2 years old by human developmental standards, with proportions and features that clearly indicated membership in the species commonly known as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. But this was not the fearsome monster of popular imagination. This was a frightened, lonely child who seemed to be seeking comfort and protection from the only human it had encountered. "The little one was obviously terrified," Thomas documented. "It approached my door with obvious caution, ready to flee at the first sign of threat, but there was also a desperate hope in its eyes, like it was looking for someone who might provide the safety and care that it desperately needed." Thomas remained perfectly still, allowing the young creature to observe him and assess whether he posed a threat. The infant Sasquatch studied Thomas with obvious intelligence, tilting its head and making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like questions or attempts at communication. "It was trying to talk to me," Thomas realized with amazement. The sounds it was making had structure and meaning, like a language that I didn't understand but that clearly conveyed emotions and intentions. After several minutes of mutual observation, the infant Sasquatch slowly approached Thomas's chair, moving with the careful deliberation of a child who had learned to be wary of potential dangers. When it reached Thomas, the creature gently touched his hand with its own tiny fingers, as if testing whether he was real and whether he would react with kindness or aggression. The touch was so gentle, so trusting, Thomas reflected. This little creature had obviously been through terrible trauma, but it was still capable of hope and trust. It was looking for someone to care for it, and somehow it had decided that I might be that person. Thomas slowly extended his hand, allowing the infant Sasquatch to examine his fingers and palm with obvious curiosity. The creature's hands were remarkably human-like, with opposable thumbs and delicate finger movements that suggested fine motor control and manipulative abilities that exceeded those of any known primate species. Its hands were almost exactly like human hands, Thomas observed, but smaller and covered with fine fur that was incredibly soft to the touch. The intelligence in those tiny fingers was obvious. This was a being capable of tool use, artistic expression, and complex manipulation of its environment. The infant Sasquatch spent nearly an hour examining Thomas's hands, touching his clothing, and studying his face with obvious fascination. Throughout the encounter, the creature made soft vocalizations that seemed to express curiosity, wonder, and a desperate need for connection with another intelligent being. It was like meeting a human child who spoke a different language, Thomas documented. And the intelligence was obvious, the emotional needs were clear, and the capacity for communication was evident, even though we didn't share a common vocabulary. When dawn approached, the infant Sasquatch reluctantly moved away from Thomas's chair and disappeared into the forest with obvious reluctance. But before leaving, it turned back to look at Thomas with an expression that clearly conveyed gratitude and hope for future encounters. It didn't want to leave, Thomas realized. The little one had found someone who wasn't afraid of it, someone who treated it with kindness and respect. It was hoping that I would be there again the next night. The pattern of nightly visits continued, with the infant Sasquatch arriving at 9:15 p.m. and spending the night on Thomas's porch, gradually becoming more comfortable and trusting as the days passed. Thomas began leaving food and water on the porch, which the creature accepted gratefully, while demonstrating table manners and eating behaviors that clearly indicated cultural training and social development. The way it ate showed that it had been raised by parents who taught it proper behavior, Thomas observed. It used its hands carefully, ate slowly and deliberately, and always cleaned up after itself. These were learned behaviors that indicated a sophisticated social structure and cultural transmission of knowledge. Thomas also noticed that the infant Sasquatch was showing signs of grief and trauma that suggested it had recently lost its family or community. The creature would sometimes make sounds that could only be described as crying, and its body language often conveyed sadness and loneliness that was heartbreaking to witness. It was morning, Thomas realized with growing concern. This little one had lost its parents or family group and was dealing with grief and trauma that was comparable to what a human child would experience in similar circumstances. The infant's grief was particularly evident during the early morning hours, when it would sit quietly on the porch and make soft, mournful sounds that seemed to express longing for family members who would never return. Thomas found these moments almost unbearable to witness, as the depth of the creature's emotional pain was obvious and heartbreaking. Thomas began researching reports of unusual military or government activity in the surrounding forest areas, trying to understand what might have happened to the infant Sasquatch's family. What he discovered through contacts in the Forestry Service and local law enforcement would horrify him and explain the creature's orphaned status. There had been classified military operations in the area, Thomas learned through discreet inquiries, helicopter flights, armed personnel, and equipment that suggested capture or elimination missions rather than routine training exercises. The operations had been conducted under the authority of a classified program that Thomas's contacts were reluctant to discuss, but the evidence suggested systematic hunting of cryptid populations for purposes that exceeded simple scientific research or wildlife management. They were killing entire families, Thomas realized with growing anger. Not just capturing specimens for study, but eliminating communities of intelligent beings who posed no threat to anyone. The infant Sasquatch that was visiting Thomas's cabin was apparently the sole survivor of one of these military operations, a traumatized orphan who had somehow escaped the fate that had befallen its family and was now seeking protection from the only human it had encountered who showed it kindness rather than hostility. The little one had watched its family being killed, Thomas understood with heartbreaking clarity. It was probably hiding somewhere nearby when the soldiers came, and it had been alone and terrified ever since. Thomas's growing attachment to the infant Sasquatch was complicated by his recognition that providing care for the creature could expose both of them to dangers from the same government forces that had killed its family. But his conscience would not allow him to abandon a frightened orphaned child, regardless of what species it belonged to. I couldn't turn my back on a child in need, Thomas reflected. Human or otherwise, this little one deserved protection and care, and I was apparently the only person in a position to provide it. Thomas began making preparations to provide more comprehensive care for his nightly visitor, setting up a shelter on his porch that would provide protection from weather while allowing the creature to maintain its independence and freedom to leave whenever it chose. The shelter was a simple lean-to structure built against the cabin wall furnished with blankets and cushions that would provide comfort and warmth during the cold mountain nights. Thomas also began stocking supplies of food that would meet the nutritional needs of a young omnivore, including fruits, vegetables, nuts, and small amounts of meat. "I wanted to provide care without imposing captivity," Thomas explained. "The little one needed safety and nutrition, but it also needed to maintain its freedom and its connection to the natural world." The infant Sasquatch's response to Thomas's preparations was immediate and touching. The creature began spending longer periods on the porch, using the shelter gratefully while maintaining its pattern of arriving at 9:15 p.m. and departing at dawn. But more significantly, the young Sasquatch began showing signs of emotional attachment to Thomas, greeting him with obvious joy and affection when he appeared on the porch and showing reluctance to leave when morning came. "It was bonding with me," Thomas realized with a mixture of joy and concern. This little creature was beginning to see me as a parental figure, someone who could provide the safety and care that it had lost when its family was killed. The emotional bond between Thomas and the infant Sasquatch deepened over the following weeks, with the creature beginning to show behaviors that indicated it was learning to trust Thomas completely and was beginning to view the cabin as a safe haven where it could find protection and comfort. The breakthrough in their relationship came on the 20th night of visits, when the infant Sasquatch arrived at Thomas's cabin in obvious distress, making vocalizations that clearly indicated fear and seeking comfort from the only source of safety it had found. "Something had frightened it badly," Thomas observed. The little one was trembling and making sounds that were obviously distress calls. It came straight to me for protection, like a human child running to a parent when scared. Thomas later learned that military helicopters had been conducting search operations in the surrounding forest areas, apparently looking for the surviving member of the Sasquatch family that had been eliminated during the previous military operation. They were hunting the little one, Thomas realized with growing alarm. The same forces that had killed its family were now trying to complete their mission by capturing or killing the sole survivor. Thomas's decision to provide active protection for the infant Sasquatch marked a turning point in their relationship and would ultimately lead to discoveries that would change everything he thought he knew about intelligence, consciousness, and the nature of family bonds across species boundaries. "I wasn't going to let them take this child," Thomas decided with absolute determination, "not after everything it had already suffered. If protecting it meant putting myself at risk, that was a price I was willing to pay." The infant Sasquatch seemed to understand that Thomas was offering protection, and its response was to move closer to the cabin and begin spending entire days in the shelter that Thomas had provided, only venturing into the forest for brief periods to gather food and exercise. "It was beginning to see the cabin as home," Thomas observed, with growing emotional attachment. "This little creature was becoming part of my family, and I was becoming the parent figure that it desperately needed." The daily routine that developed between Thomas and his young companion revealed the extraordinary intelligence and emotional capacity of the infant Sasquatch. The creature demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceeded those of human children its age, communication skills that suggested complex language development, and emotional responses that clearly indicated consciousness and self-awareness. "It was learning English," Thomas documented with amazement, "not just understanding simple commands, but beginning to use words and phrases to communicate its needs and feelings." The language learning process was remarkable to observe, as the infant Sasquatch demonstrated an ability to acquire vocabulary and grammar structures at a rate that exceeded normal human development. The creature would listen intently to Thomas's conversations with himself, repeat words and phrases with careful attention to pronunciation, and experiment with combining words to express increasingly complex ideas. The infant Sasquatch's first clear English word was Thomas, which it pronounced with careful deliberation after weeks of listening to Thomas talk to himself and to the creature. The emotional impact of hearing his name spoken by this orphaned child was overwhelming for Thomas. "When it said my name, I knew that we had crossed a line from caregiver and dependent to something that could only be described as family," Thomas reflected. "This little being had chosen me as its parent, and I had chosen it as my child." The language development continued rapidly, with the infant Sasquatch learning dozens of words and beginning to form simple sentences that expressed its thoughts, feelings, and needs. The creature's intelligence was clearly superior to that of human children its age, with learning capabilities that suggested cognitive abilities that exceeded normal human development. It was learning faster than any human child I had ever observed, Thomas noted. Not just memorizing words, but understanding concepts, making connections, and using language creatively to express complex ideas. But perhaps most remarkably, the infant Sasquatch began sharing information about its family and community that revealed the existence of a sophisticated culture with language, art, technology, and social structures that rivaled human civilization in complexity and exceeded it in harmony with the natural environment. It told me about its mother and father, Thomas documented with growing amazement, about brothers and sisters, grandparents, and a community of dozens of individuals who lived in carefully hidden settlements throughout the Pacific Northwest. The stories that the young Sasquatch shared revealed a civilization that had existed alongside human society for thousands of years, maintaining secrecy and avoiding contact while developing technologies and cultural practices that were perfectly adapted to forest environments. They had art, music, literature, and scientific knowledge that was passed down through generations, Thomas learned. A complete civilization that had remained hidden from human awareness while developing solutions to environmental and social problems that human society was still struggling to understand. The infant Sasquatch described elaborate family structures with multiple generations living together in harmony, educational systems that emphasized both practical skills and cultural knowledge, and artistic traditions that included music, storytelling, and visual arts that were created using natural materials and techniques that had been refined over centuries. The family groups were like extended clans, the young Sasquatch explained in its developing English. Everyone had roles and responsibilities, but everyone was also cared for and valued. Children learned from grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, and older siblings. Knowledge was shared freely, and no one was ever alone or abandoned. The infant Sasquatch's descriptions of its family's fate confirmed Thomas's worst fears about the government operations that had been conducted in the area. The military forces had not been conducting scientific research or wildlife management. They had been systematically exterminating an intelligent species that posed no threat to human society. They killed everyone, the young Sasquatch told Thomas in its developing English. Mama, papa, brothers, sisters, grandparents, all gone. Only me left. The emotional impact of hearing this child describe the murder of its entire family was devastating for Thomas, but it also strengthened his resolve to protect the sole survivor and to expose the truth about what the government had done. This wasn't wildlife management or scientific research, Thomas realized with growing anger. This was genocide, the systematic extermination of an intelligent species for reasons that had nothing to do with legitimate government purposes. The young Sasquatch's account of the attack was heartbreaking in its detail and clarity. The creature described hiding in a hollow tree, while soldiers with advanced weapons systematically hunted down every member of its family group, showing no mercy for children, elderly individuals, or those who attempted to surrender. They came in the night, the infant Sasquatch recalled with obvious trauma. Big flying machines with bright lights and loud noises. Soldiers with guns that made people fall asleep, then other guns that made them never wake up. I hid like Mama told me, but I could hear everything. I could hear my family crying and calling for help, but the soldiers didn't care. Thomas began documenting everything he learned from the infant Sasquatch, recording conversations, taking photographs and gathering evidence that could be used to expose the government operations and protect other Sasquatch communities from similar attacks. I had to tell the world what had happened, Thomas decided. This child's family had been murdered, and the people responsible needed to be held accountable for their crimes. But Thomas's efforts to expose the truth would put both him and his young companion in danger from the same forces that had killed the infant's family, leading to a confrontation that would test the bonds between them and ultimately reveal the true extent of the government conspiracy against cryptid populations. The crisis came on the 43rd night of visits, when military helicopters surrounded Thomas's cabin and armed personnel demanded that he surrender the specimen that intelligence reports indicated he was harboring. "We know you have it," the military commander announced through a loudspeaker. "Surrender the creature immediately and you will not be harmed." Thomas's response was to step onto his porch with the infant Sasquatch beside him, making it clear that he would not allow the child to be taken without a fight. "This is not a specimen," Thomas called back to the military forces. "This is a child, an orphan child whose family you murdered. I will not allow you to complete your genocide." What happened next would shock the military personnel and ultimately lead to the exposure of the government conspiracy that had been responsible for the systematic extermination of cryptid populations throughout the Pacific Northwest. The infant Sasquatch, faced with the same forces that had killed its family, did not flee or hide as the military personnel expected. Instead, it stepped forward and began speaking directly to the soldiers in clear, articulate English that left no doubt about its intelligence and consciousness. "You killed my family," the young Sasquatch said with dignity and courage that exceeded its years. "You murdered my mother and father, my brothers and sisters, my grandparents and cousins. But I am not afraid of you anymore. Thomas has shown me that some humans are good, and I will not let you hurt him the way you hurt my family." The impact of hearing an obviously intelligent, articulate child describe the murder of its family was devastating for the military personnel, many of whom had not been told the true nature of their mission or the intelligence level of their targets. "We were told we were eliminating dangerous animals," one soldier would later testify. "Nobody told us we were killing children and families. Nobody told us we were committing genocide against an intelligent species." The confrontation at Thomas's cabin marked the beginning of a congressional investigation that would expose the full extent of the government conspiracy against cryptid populations and lead to the establishment of legal protections for non-human intelligence. "Thomas and that brave little child changed everything," noted Congressman David Martinez, who chaired the investigation. Their courage in standing up to illegal government operations saved not just their own lives, but potentially the lives of hundreds of other cryptid individuals who were targeted for extermination. The infant Sasquatch, who chose the name Hope for its interactions with human society, became the first non-human individual to testify before Congress, providing evidence that led to criminal charges against the officials responsible for the extermination operations. Hope's testimony was the most powerful moment in congressional history, observed legal scholar Dr. Patricia Williams. Hearing this child describe the murder of its family in its own words made it impossible for anyone to deny the reality of what had been done. Thomas was appointed as Hope's legal guardian and official advocate, a role that allowed him to continue providing care and protection while helping to establish protocols for interaction between human society and cryptid communities. Thomas became more than just Hope's adoptive father, noted Dr. Williams. He became a bridge between species, helping to establish understanding and cooperation where there had previously been only fear and violence. The relationship between Thomas and Hope continued to deepen over the following years, with Hope developing into a remarkable young individual who served as an ambassador between human and cryptid communities while maintaining the close family bond that had begun with those first gentle knocks on Thomas's door. "Hope taught me that family isn't about species or biology," Thomas reflected. "It's about love, care, and commitment to each other's welfare. Hope is my child in every way that matters, and I am proud to be its father." The establishment of legal protections for cryptid populations led to the discovery of numerous communities throughout North America, many of which had been living in fear of government persecution for generations. "Hope's courage in speaking out saved its entire species," observed Dr. Martinez. "By exposing the truth about government operations, Hope prevented the complete extermination of one of the most intelligent species on Earth." The ongoing relationship between Thomas and Hope has become a model for human cryptid cooperation, demonstrating that understanding and family bonds can transcend any difference in appearance or origin. "Every night when Hope was knocking on my door, it was asking for more than just shelter," Thomas realized. "It was asking for family, for love, for someone who would see it as a person rather than a creature. I'm grateful that I was able to provide that, and I'm grateful that Hope chose me to be its father." The legacy of those 43 nights of gentle knocking continues to influence policy and research, serving as a reminder that intelligence, consciousness, and the capacity for love exist throughout the natural world in forms that humanity is only beginning to understand. Hope's story shows us what's possible when we approach other species with openness and compassion, Thomas concluded. "That little child changed my life and changed the world, all because it had the courage to keep knocking on my door until someone finally answered with love instead of fear." If you found Thomas and Hope's incredible story as moving and inspiring as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into government cover-ups, interspecies relationships, and the amazing stories of love and family that transcend all boundaries. Share this video to spread awareness about the importance of protecting all intelligent life and treating every conscious being with dignity and respect. And let us know in the comments what you think about Thomas's decision to protect hope and the future of human-cryptid relations. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you stories that reveal the power of love and family to overcome fear and create understanding between all forms of consciousness.